I read about Le Corbusier and the beginning of white as a kind of convention and the workers' housing and all of these kinds of things that had to do that were about this kind of particular implication of transcendence and that had come to be seen as neutral. So I just wanted to make sure that I acknowledged that. And that was the beginning of them. And the same with the shirts. The fact is that white shirts meant that they could be cleaned more frequently. So there was a class issue in them as they first started to wear white. Or you could replace them if they got stained. Therefore, if you were poor, you weren't going to have a white shirt. It was an aristocracy. It was an emblem of aristocracy. And so the way in which that went from being an emblem of aristocracy to an emblem of the worker and neutrality was just really interesting to me. But I again, in all of these things, I like my topics to be loaded and specific, but I don't like them to be one-liners, which, back to the thing about a signature-ish image, perhaps it would be great if I wanted you to go in and get it, perhaps then it would be easier. But that's just not my sensibility. I want you to go in and have to figure. I want it to be specific enough that it's loaded, but I don't want you to spell it out for you.
And I have a quote of yours here. It says, "When I work abstract, I want the material to be loaded with information."
Yes.
And I think that that kind of ties in with where the next step in that progression was. We started working with the labels.
Right. Basically, I started that because I cut the. It had been the viruses came from lampshades because they were natural forms, and my father-in-law at that time was a virologist, and I noticed that the lampshades put together made virus patterns. So I was like, oh, this is interesting. Then it went to the shirts. Then it was wanting to go to more neutral drapery. But while I was doing the shirts, I decided I needed to cut some of the labels out of the shirts. And so the first thing was I had all these great labels, and I decided I would pretend I was an abstract painter, and I would just pin them to the wall in patterns that would be, that might blush a little in the center and be these kind of modernist patterns, but would be, deal with this commodity thing, but sort of neutralize it at the same time. Weirdly, they were, and so they might be all the labels that tell you where they were made, or they might be all the size labels, or they might be the brands. And I thought it was the DNA of the material that I was doing. So the first ones were actual labels cut out of shirts. Then I was in the show shopping in Deitch Projects, which was because Soho was turning into a shopping district. We were to collaborate with some merchant in Soho and do something in the gallery and then do something with the merchant. And so I designed my first label, which was photocopied out of from the John Berryman song. It said present or present, or I liked the word because it had multiple ways. Once it was removed from the poem, you no longer knew exactly how to use it and what it meant. And then I arranged to work with a tailor, where you could go into the tailor shop, and I did this display window, and you could go into the tailor shop and have one of those labels. You'd have to, the only way you could get it was a cheap thing, you'd pay $1 and whatever his fee was to sew it in, and you could have it sewn into your own shirt if he could cut the label out of your shirt or out of your clothing. You could, any piece of clothing, he would put my label in if you brought it in. And then I did one of those, what I suppose now are a kind of signature pinned up label pieces on the wall in the gallery, like you would have. And I think I'd hung a set of collars with the labels cut out of them, so that maybe with one of the labels sewn into the bottom one. I think that's what I did, so that there was a signature, because I like that kind of brand issue, but the brand didn't mean anything. Right. And I worked with a label manufacturer here in Dallas.
So it's only a matter of time before you wind up having your own luxury brand.
That's right. I've had 14 labels over the years. I think that's the amount. And it was great. The first ones I did, when I called the label manufacturer here, and I had them made, he was, because they didn't work as advertising the way that he thought they should. He adjusted them so that they were different because he thought they were too quiet. And like, no, you've got to, like he sent me the samples and I said, no, this is like a work of art. You've got to do it the way I want you to do it. But afterwards, we developed this really great relationship, and through all the labels, I used the same company here and the same guy was who was the company. He owned it when I started, and then it was purchased by somebody else, but he's continued to work there. And so they'd always send, when I'd call in, I would always get him. And it's funny because his daughter was like a docent at the DMA, so that at some point she was like, no, this guy, he's like a well-known artist. Which it gave him no end of thrill that his daughter knew who I was, and I think they came to one of the shows here at Talley's.
Right. And so you have you utilize those labels. You've pinned them to walls. You've stitched them together and hung them, by the end, sort of like with the drapery. You've stacked them and made pieces that maybe are evocative of Stella or Agnes Martin, and those. So that was a point where and so some of those pieces from a distance they communicate one thing, but once you get up close, you say, okay, what is in the DNA of this piece? Right. What was it made of?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Right, and so then you've continued the body of work. Again, there's I think of the drapes. I think of the collars, and I love the buckyball. There's a number of those. I think that's an interesting piece to talk about, because where did you gather inspiration for that?
Well, really it harkens back, because we only have so many ideas. It harkens back to the early virus piece with the lampshades. But what I realized is that I wanted to set up a problem in which you would choose something that was that you imagined would be alike. So, and in this case, obviously from the vocabulary of my work, that would be the collars, and that those things, but each of them would be individual in a way. And so that as you would start out making a pattern that would be this kind of perfect pattern, which shows up in viruses and shows up in the buckyball and shows up in soccer balls and shows up in all of these places that that you would start out with this, and I'd just read about the buckyball, so because actually each one of these things were individualized, the pattern would fail. And so what I wanted was to start out as this is this kind of constructed failures in some of my other works, the pinned up grids. It's impossible to sustain that gesture. And so it's the effort, some of the poetry comes from the effort of sustaining something that's ideal that then breaks down into a more natural pattern. It's the same thing on these buckyballs. I'd start out I'm going to do this 3, 5, it would be the exact pattern that would be the buckyball pattern, and then I'd have to resolve it. Sure. And that resolution then becomes this kind of point.
Right, and I think this is something I would love to talk to you about. Is I think you would consider yourself at the end of the day a conceptual artist, and I was speaking with an artist recently, and we were talking about whether it's best for a distinct concept to lead the construction of the work, or whether experimentation lead the construction and then find the concept as it emerges. And because I see the buckyball, and I think part of in explaining it there, it's almost like the only way for it's like it's forced conformity, but it breaks down because each one of the collars is a different size. And you think societally, those societies where there's forced conformity, ultimately it breaks down because there's no way for us to ultimately be conformist because we're each unique. Right. And so I guess the question is, do you think about that going into it, or is it part of the magic that emerges on the backside?
And probably the answer to that is both. Okay, I consider the way I have my practice a lot more. I use this all the time when talking to, particularly to younger artists, but I consider it a lot like gardening. I plant a bunch of seeds, okay, and I think I know what they are, and at least what their sources are, and where they're coming from, and I put a good deal of thought into them, and then they grow, and that growing is part of their life in and of themselves, and I respond to it, and maybe then they turn out to be about some other things. I leave that, I recognize that I have certain skills. I think, without trying to sound, I'm a really good formal artist, like compositionally. It's one of those things that initially was probably not, was not the coolest thing to say, but the fact is that compositionally, both 2D and 3D, I go on. That's sort of a given. I just figure it means it's the same as saying I can use a good vocabulary. So what I do, and I have a strong historical sense. So I have those things, I just count them as given. They're sort of like fertilizer in there or something. And so this thing will happen, and sometimes it's just a more organic relationship. So sometimes something will come up and it'll alter the idea, and then I'll go with that, and I'll find out more about the idea, and that'll change it, or maybe it'll change it. When you were talking about me running series of things, once I run out of a new thing to think about, I'm over it, okay? Like, I only work on something. I might go back to doing something I've done before if suddenly it strikes me that it has a new facet to it, because I don't like that linearity thing that you're taught that you're supposed to expect. I like the fact that, again, using the garden metaphor, if it's time to plant tomatoes again because it seems like it's right time to plant tomatoes, I'll plant them again. But there is a moment then, the moment that becomes critical is the moment that I harvest. And I go, okay, we're going to pull this little body of stuff together, and this is a show, okay? Right. And this is going out into the world, and there has to be a degree of precision about what this is about. And they'll tell you that, and anyone who works with me in a show, that I'm nuts about my installations. I'm concerned about what you see first, a current exhibition that's opening tonight, how you walk in, what you see first, what you turn and see, what's hidden from you. What I'm like obsessed with the way in which this unfolds, because by now I've selected down to like this little precise moment of experience that I'm giving you that hopefully amplifies out into the things I was thinking about, or the way in which you think about a corollary.
Sure. Well, tell me more about the current body. I mean, it's 3D in some drawings?
Well, it's 3D in these collages, but I consider them drawings. Okay, one of the terms I used recently when I was describing the body, what it means, both of these bodies together, because they have a certain separation, is that they're kind of like analog GPS. Mm-hmm. It's like, you know how when you're looking at your GPS and you're the blue dot and the red thing's over here, and you really don't see a goddamn thing around you, you know what I mean? You're just moving from the blue dot to the red dot, and you really don't actually know where you are. You're simply the dot, and you're in a digital matrix and you're moving through. I decided maybe starting these bodies of work and some things that preface them, I decided I had a feeling that it wasn't that I needed to understand a little bit more clearly and be responsible for where I was at, both kind of physically as a manifestation of it, like where am I, and and what is going on, and I need to be attentive here. The context of that, because a lot of this, probably if you go with the GPS thing, we're getting so much information, and there's a lot of practices that are research-based and so forth, but that information comes in an unfixed way. It's
Sure.
like it's a flowing of information.